What changes are needed in the U.S. power grid to deal with rapid shifts in the industry? That's what Platts senior correspondent Chris Newkumet will discuss. Chris?
Many moving parts and levels of influence are driving big changes to the U.S. power grid these days. There's no more business as usual, as power comes to U.S. homes and businesses in many different packages. All this is creating challenges for an entrenched utility sector and its customer base. Here to walk us through some new research and analysis is Ben Paulos, Project Manager for America's Power Plan. Welcome, Ben. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Well, let me read from your report. I found an interesting quote here. It asserts that the U.S. is in the early days of a radical makeover that will drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase system flexibility, incorporate new technologies, and shake existing utility business models. Really? Is that just wishful thinking? That's a mouthful.
Mm-hmm. No, we think it is happening. America's Power Plan is really based on three observations. The first is that a whole suite of new technologies is coming to the market that is causing some significant changes. Coal and nuclear are really being challenged by new wholesale technologies like natural gas and renewables. On the demand side, the customer side, the world of the internet is coming to electricity. It's the internet of electricity. So smart appliances, solar panels on your roof, electric cars, these are all drastically changing the relationship between the consumer and the utility. The second point is that these changes are causing a challenge to the traditional way of doing business for utilities. The old days of the utility owning the power plants and the lines and the customers is really giving way to a much more diverse system. And lastly, our regulations, our laws and rules are an impediment to that kind of innovation. We need to figure out a way that utilities can innovate and evolve to adapt to the new world.
You mentioned solar. Your report also asserts that experience globally is demonstrating that it's easier to integrate much higher shares of renewables more rapidly than previously thought. Mm-hmm. Now, some would challenge that notion, particularly as it applies here in the U.S. What do you say to that?
I think the grid operators, the people who run the power system, are used to variability. They have to be used to it because demand is unpredictable. And the fact that we're adding variable generation like wind and solar is just another thing that they get to deal with. There are a whole suite of, there are many tools they have to apply to that issue. They continue to have dispatchable power plants. If you can create larger areas, a balancing area it's called, that the variability becomes reduced. There are, in the longer term, as we get to higher levels, I think we'll see more storage happening. We'll see more...
Yeah, understood. But let's narrow the focus here a little bit. We talked about this earlier. I mean, what cities are kind of on the front line of this integration of renewables and traditional utility practices?
Yeah, there are certain places in the U.S. and around the world that are really seeing this kind of future today. One good example is San Diego, which San Diego Gas and Electric has 27,000 customers with solar panels.
27,000 people have panels on their roof.
And most of that really installed in the last few years.
Wow.
And that's continuing at a rapid clip. They have more than 6,000 customers with electric cars, all in the last year or two. That's also increasing quickly at the same pace as hybrids have penetrated the market. So San Diego is looking at that and thinking that this is the future of energy in their service territory. And they're thinking that they are going to have to evolve as a company. Rather than having that sort of one-way relationship with their customers, it's going to be a multifaceted, multi-directional relationship.
Well, there's a situation in Arizona. The Arizona Public Service Commission dealt with this. You talk about solar panels on the roof, and how does a utility basically get paid for keeping these fellows on the grid? And they recently passed a reg that applies a surcharge, they fixed charge to anybody who has a solar panels on their roof. Right. Tell me a little bit more about that. I think it's 70 cents, is that right, per kilowatt?
Right, per month, yep.
And how does that work?
Yeah, well, this is a perfect example of regulations that can either encourage or discourage innovation. There are sort of three fundamental principles that, first of all, you have the right to produce your own power. This is America. We can put whatever we want on our roofs. Number two, as long as we're connected to the grid is giving us value. The utilities are providing a service to those customers, and the utilities deserve to be paid for that. And lastly, the customer is also providing value to the grid. They're creating a new power plant with their own money, and they deserve to be compensated for those values. So once you agree with those principles, it becomes an issue of figuring out what the appropriate compensation to the utility is, what the appropriate compensation to the customer is. And that's the kind of policy evolution we need to see happen so that we have a graceful transition to that kind of a future.
But in Arizona, they've essentially recognized that the utility has to have something to stand ready to serve these homes with solar panels.
Exactly.
Representing traditional utilities, the Edison Electric Institute's on record as saying that as renewable costs drop, this threatens the centralized utility model. Is your father's Oldsmobile facing extinction here? The centralized utility being, they produce energy, transmit it, and distribute it.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely evolving rapidly, and it's really it's the business model that needs to change. Someone will need to run the grid and keep the lights on. Someone will need to maintain the lines and so on. And that's likely going to be forever a utility. But what's changing is that the customers are becoming much more involved in the equation. There's much more distributed generation, much more intelligence. The generators that are on the grid are much different. A wind and solar, those projects are much different than traditional gas or coal plant.
Ben Paulos from America's Power Plant, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.